What is going on, baseball fans? Jeremy Laracuente here for the Baseball Banter Broadcast. And on this broadcast, we're going to be bantering about my official, unofficial 2023 Hall of Fame ballot. Now, the way that I go about this list is the same way that the BBWAA, the Baseball Writers Association of America, go about their vote. A maximum of 10 potential candidates are selected. And if we adhere to the voting rules, if a player doesn't get 5% of the vote, they will be removed from the ballot. So there are those considerations when I make these selections. So we're going to get into my ballot here, but I just want to say that this list, the order that we're going in is alphabetical, not in terms of anything else other than that. So we're going to begin with Carlos Beltran. When you look at what Beltran is going to be as a new addition to this list, there's no doubt about it. He's going to be penalized because of his involvement in the 2017 Astro sign stealing scandal. But in my opinion, regardless of what happened with that whole situation, we are now several years removed, but even more so than that, Beltran as a player deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. There's no doubt about it. This was one of the very best center fielders that we have ever seen in baseball. His ability, and when you look at just his statistics alone, a Baseball Reference WAR of 70.1 and an F-WAR, Fangraphs WAR of 67.1. Jay Jaffe of Fangraphs has created this system and says that Hall of Famers really are going to be around a WAR of 55. This makes Carlos Beltran tremendously more valuable as a Hall of Fame candidate. Yes, there's going to be backlash. There's going to be people that are going to leave him off their ballots because of what happened with the sign stealing scandal. But when you look at this player purely on a statistical metric, Carlos Beltran is a Hall of Famer, and that's why he makes my list. Now, next up on my list is Mark Buehrle. When you look at Buehrle, you may not look at his statistics and his career as a surefire Hall of Famer. But when you break down his talent, his stats, his statistics, he has a Baseball Reference WAR of 60. And this was a guy who was super durable, pitching on average, 221 innings a season. In our top 10 starting pitchers right now, I made a very big deal about Sandy Alcantara and his 228 innings of work in 2022 was the most in a Major League Baseball. Right now, Buehrle, yes, even though during his time, that number of 221 innings on average through a 162 game season was more kind of in line with normal numbers. It still was a tremendous amount of workload. This was a guy who pitched a ton throughout the course of his career, amassing over 3,200 innings of work, an ERA plus of 117. This is a guy who absolutely deserves a ton more of a look, who deserves more consideration. And when you just break it down and use Jay Jaffe's system, this is a guy who comes in over that threshold of 55 career WAR. And when you look at where it would place Mark Buehrle in terms of career WAR and Hall of Fame consideration, it places him directly between Jim Bunning and Hal Newhouser, two guys who would not be left off of a Hall of Fame ballot if the BBWAA was putting that vote in today. This is a guy who, in my opinion, is a Hall of Fame candidate. Next up on my list is Todd Helton. When you look at Todd Helton, his career is penalized by being a Colorado Rocky. I've said it before, I'll say it again, I will say it till I'm blue in the face or till he's elected to the Hall of Fame. If this player played his entire career for another organization, put up the same exact numbers, he would have already been in the Hall of Fame. But because there is a Colorado bias, because of the high altitude, his offensive numbers get skewed and they are looked at very differently. But when you look at the way that the high altitude affects Todd Helton, potentially benefits him offensively when he's at home in Colorado, it will also negatively affect his body and his ability on the road. There's no doubt about it that this is a player who absolutely was tremendous in terms of his ability. Helton, according to baseballreference.com, has a career WAR of 61.8, which again puts him over the limit for Jay Jaffe's system. And yes, that's not an end-all be-all number, but Todd Helton would fall right in line with the middle of the pack when it comes to first basemen that are in the Hall of Fame. Is he going to be amongst the upper echelon of first base Hall of Famers? No, but he is going to be squarely in that middle. He's not going to be at the bottom end either. I think that there's an opportunity to really break down the career of Todd Helton, see just how valuable he was on both sides of the ball. This was a guy who was truly capable of carrying a Colorado Rockies team for very many years, and he's being penalized because of the ballpark and the team that he was drafted to in the ballpark that he called home. There's no reason why Todd Helton shouldn't already have been in the Hall of Fame, but he definitely deserves a vote, and he would get my official, unofficial vote for the Hall of Fame. Now, next up on my list is Torrey Hunter. When you look at Torrey Hunter and you just examine his offensive numbers, it's a lackluster case for a Hall of Fame player. This is the Hall of Very Good when it comes to just offensively for Torrey Hunter. But the Hall of Fame is about the entire career. And this was a 9-time Gold Glove winner in center field. That in and of itself deserves a ton of merit. I think there's a very, very good chance that Torrey Hunter gets overlooked and gets kind of knocked down in terms of his Hall of Fame consideration because of the fact that his offensive numbers weren't necessarily the greatest numbers you have ever seen. But when you pair that offense with the tremendous defense, yes, that is going to be the majority of his cases defensively. But when you pair it all together, to me, Torrey Hunter is a Hall of Famer. Now, another guy that gets a ton of consideration because of his defense is Andruw Jones. But there's no question, when you look at Andruw Jones, offensively, this is a much better player as well. When you compare the two cases, Torrey Hunter and Andruw Jones, they're very similar because they are defense first, but Jones puts much more to the offensive numbers as well. I think that there's an opportunity to really look back and remember just how good this player was. I think that injuries really took a toll on Andruw Jones's body later on in his career that didn't really allow him to kind of fully embrace and fully develop the numbers that kind of benchmark Hall of Fame ability. I think that when you look at what he was able to do with his career, 434 home runs, 1,300 RBIs, and over 1,900 hits, this is a guy who has a ton of merit to be a Hall of Famer. Again, he's a 10-time Gold Glove winner in center field during a time where there was so many good center fielders. There, to me, is no doubt about it that Andruw Jones belongs in the Hall of Fame. Now, next up on my list is Jeff Kent. I think that when you look at Kent, this is a guy who often gets penalized because he wasn't a Gold Glove caliber defender. Now, never will Jeff Kent be considered or confused with a Gold Glover, but this was an adequate defender, somebody who, if the ball's hit at him, he's going to be able to make the play. But his merit comes on his offensive ability. This is arguably the best offensive second baseman in the history of Major League Baseball. Kent would hit 377 home runs, had an OPS plus for his 17-year Major League career of 136. Again, league average is 100. Most often, you're looking at MVP caliber players in a season to have an OPS plus of 140. For his 17-year career, Kent had an OPS plus of 136. This is an MVP level candidate each and every single season of his career, and definitely deserves to be able to be included in the Hall of Fame. This is, again, arguably the best hitting second baseman in Major League Baseball history, and deserves a place in Cooperstown. Now, next up on my list is Francisco Rodriguez, aka K-Rod. Now, with K-Rod, when you look at the numbers, there isn't a ton here to really base a Hall of Fame entry on per se. But again, as I mentioned at the top of this video, the BBWAA has a ruling, a Hall of Fame ruling, that if you don't get 5% of the vote, you fall off the ballot. We've seen a tremendous number of Hall of Fame worthy players fall off the ballot in their first year because of not receiving the 5% total. I think that there's an opportunity that could possibly happen to Francisco Rodriguez, but I don't think that his case necessarily should fall off that quickly. I think that for that reason, this is why I voted for K-Rod. I think that his case deserves a longer look. There should be a little bit more statistical analysis done on what he was capable of doing, especially given his era. There was a 16-year major league career, and yes, he had only 976 innings, dealt with some injuries, especially towards the end. There's going to be a lot of times where a guy like K-Rod is going to be overlooked. But for that reason, he gets my vote to stay on the ballot, to be able to kind of give a little bit more of a comprehensive look and examination over his career. So for that reason, he ends up on my ballot. Now, next up on my list is the guy who, in my opinion, is going to be often overlooked as one of the very best at his position, but it is Scott Rowland. When you look at Rowland, and I've been a very big proponent for Scott Rowland for the past couple of seasons, that he deserves Hall of Fame entry. He should have been in already. Third base is the most overlooked position, in my opinion, when it comes to the Hall of Fame. I think that there's a ton of guys who are, especially coming up over the next few years and the next decade, that are at this position that are going to be potentially overlooked. Scott Rowland is one of them. This is a guy who was a premium defender, always played third base. He did not make the shift over to other positions towards the later half of his career. This was a guy that stayed as a third baseman, super underrepresented position in the Hall of Fame voting. And when you look at his career, 17 years, Scott would have 316 home runs, 1,287 RBIs, an OPS plus of 122, and a WAR of 70.1, according to BaseballReference.com. This is a guy who deserves entry into the Hall of Fame because he was a defensive monster. This is, again, during his playing career, he was the guy who we now look at as like the Manny Machado, the Nolan Arenado, the defensive stalwart. This was the guy who was compared to Brooks Robinson. This is a guy who deserves entry into the Hall of Fame, and I will say it till I'm blue in the face. This is one of the best defensive third basemen we have ever seen in Major League Baseball. For me, Scott Rowland is no doubt a Hall of Fame. Now, next up on my list is Gary Sheffield. Now, the case for Gary Sheffield is one that comes with a bit of controversy. Yes, this was a controversial player. His name was listed on the Mitchell report, and most often the guys that were listed on that report tend to get overlooked when it comes to the BBWAA and the balloting for Hall of Fame. But when you look at Gary Sheffield's case, his numbers statistically, this is a Hall of Fame caliber player. I think that we kind of penalize certain players for being on the Mitchell report and don't penalize other players. David Ortiz, that got in without any hesitation last season, was on that same report. But Gary Sheffield gets penalized. Barry Bonds got penalized. Roger Clemens got penalized. Yes, there is controversy surrounding these guys. But to me, there's already players in the Hall of Fame that did steroids, that were on that PED list. And you know, not to name names, but we know who they are. We know who the players that we believe were a part of that era that we were performing because of some extra enhancements. To me, Gary Sheffield often gets overlooked and knocked down because of the era that he played in and kind of having these things around him because of being on that initial Mitchell report. To me, there's no doubt about it. When you look at his ability, when you look at what he was able to do over his career, Gary Sheffield is a Hall of Fame level player. 509 home runs, 1,676 RBIs, 253 stolen bases, a career slash line of 292, 393, 514, an OPS plus of 140. And like I mentioned with Jeff Kent just a moment ago, MVPs are looked at that 140 level. This was an MVP caliber player for his entire career, ending with a Baseball Reference WAR of 60.5. To me, this is a guy who merits entry into the Hall of Fame. Now, as we look last on my list, again, just because of alphabetical order, Billy Wagner. This, to me, is a guy who gets overlooked because of his innings worked. When you look and you compare the numbers between Billy Wagner and a guy who was a no doubt Hall of Famer in Trevor Hoffman, their numbers are very similar. When you take and you discount the innings and the save total, which Billy Wagner worked a lot of setup role during the early parts of his career in different parts throughout his career, as opposed to the closing role where he was getting those saves and finishing off those games in that manner. This is a guy who absolutely merits entry. Yes, there is a difference in the workload. Wagner pitched 903 innings for his 16-year Major League career compared to 1,089 in the third innings for Trevor Hoffman through his 18-year career. But when you compare the career ERA plus of 141 that Trevor Hoffman had for his career, according to baseballreference.com, and the career ERA plus of 187 for Billy Wagner, this is a better pitcher. You also take into account the FIP, the fielding independent pitching, the things that a pitcher controls, strikeouts, walks, and home runs. Wagner's career FIP was 2.73. This is a guy who, without question, if you just wipe away the innings total, would all have already been inducted into the Hall of Fame. To me, Wagner gets penalized because of not having over 1,000 innings pitched as a reliever. But there's no doubt about it, when you look at the production, this is a guy you wanted on the mound. This was a guy who dominated when he was on the mound. So for me, Billy Wagner is a Hall of Famer. But I want to hear from you guys. Let me know who would make your Hall of Fame ballot in 2023. We're going to get that announcement Tuesday, the 24th of January, from the actual Baseball Writers Association of America. We're going to get that announcement on MLB Network. So again, I want to know your list. I want to know who you believe should be entered into the Hall of Fame using the same criteria that the BBWAA uses. So a maximum of 10 potential selections. Let me know your thoughts, your reasonings down in the comments, or you can find me over on Twitter at banter_baseball, where we can keep the conversation rolling about who makes your official, unofficial 2023 Major League Baseball Hall of Fame ballot. But again, keep it locked in here at the Baseball Banter Broadcast by hitting the subscribe button and the bell for post notifications as we continue to try to bring you the latest news, notes, and my personal thoughts, theories, and opinions on the game of Major League Baseball. Peace.